Alien girl helps human escape a burning dome, but the dome collapses following human. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. The dome was engulfed in flames, and the thick, acrid smoke billowed high into the sky, choking the air with a sense of imminent destruction. Inside the structure, chaos reigned as fire and debris rained down from every direction. Jake Miller, a human engineer, had been working late, unaware that the structure was slowly falling apart around him. The heat was unbearable, his skin burning from the heat as he stumbled through the smoke-filled corridors, trying to make his way to safety. Panic set in as he realized the exits were blocked, and his chances of survival were slim. Just as hope seemed lost, a figure emerged from the shadows, Zara Lyrex, an alien warrior from the distant planet Tora. Her glowing blue skin flickered in the firelight as she sprinted toward him, her movements graceful despite the chaos around them. Without a word, she reached out, pulling him with surprising strength toward a narrow escape route. "Come on, human!" "This way," she shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames. Jake barely had time to react, but something about her presence gave him hope, a glimmer of survival in a situation that seemed beyond saving. With Zara leading the way, they pushed through the thick smoke, their footsteps echoing through the collapsing structure. Every step felt like a race against time, and the sound of the walls creaking under the pressure of the fire only spurred them on faster. Zara's alien physiology seemed to be unaffected by the heat, her confidence unwavering as she pulled Jake through the wreckage. "We're almost there," she said, her eyes focused ahead. But just as they reached the exit, the dome above them groaned ominously, and with a violent crack, the ceiling above them gave way. Jake's heart skipped a beat as massive debris began to fall, blocking their escape route. With no time to think, Zara acted instinctively, pushing Jake out of the way and taking the brunt of the collapsing structure herself. Jake looked back, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. Zara, injured but not defeated, stood tall amidst the chaos, her hand extended toward him. "You have to keep moving, human," she said, a slight grimace crossing her face as she struggled to remain upright. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed her hand and helped her to her feet, both of them barely managing to escape the falling debris. The two of them, now bound by the shared experience of survival, made it out of the burning dome just as the last of the structure collapsed behind them, leaving only smoke and ruins in its wake. They both fell to the ground, gasping for air, the danger now behind them. But the silence that followed was deafening, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Jake looked at Zara, her glowing skin now darkened by soot and ash. "Thank you," he breathed, his voice filled with gratitude. Zara nodded, her eyes meeting his. "We live to fight another day," she said simply, the bond between them already forming in the aftermath of the fire. The fire was finally beginning to die down, the air still thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Jake Miller lay flat on the ground, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to regain control of his breath. The pain in his legs from running through the smoke-filled corridors was now settling in, but there was something deeper, more pressing, the realization of what had just happened. Zara Lyrex, the alien who had risked her life to save him, was barely able to stand beside him. Her glowing blue skin was smeared with soot, her silvery hair disheveled, and her expression, usually stoic, now carried the weight of exhaustion. The collapse of the dome had narrowly missed them, but the shock of the near-death experience hung over them both. Zara, ever the warrior, had been forced to push her body to the limit in order to ensure Jake's survival. Yet, even now, she stood tall, as if the danger were already behind her. "Are you all right?" Jake finally asked, his voice hoarse, still trying to steady his pulse. Zara's golden eyes met his, a faint glimmer of something unspoken flickering in them. "I will be," she said, her voice calm despite the situation. She reached out, steadying herself by placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. Her strength was undeniable, but there was a weariness in her that wasn't there before. He watched her closely, noticing how the alien's confidence, usually unwavering, was now tempered by the gravity of what they had just survived. "You saved my life," Jake continued, his voice softer this time, as he slowly got to his feet, assisted by Zara. "I owe you everything." Zara didn't respond immediately. She looked around at the wreckage of the dome, the twisted metal and burning debris that had once been a place of safety now turned into a tomb for so many who hadn't made it out. "I did what anyone would do," she said finally, her voice distant. "Survival is instinct." But Jake knew better. He could see the pride in her eyes, the unwavering commitment to something greater than just her own life. She had risked everything. "It was more than just instinct," Jake said, shaking his head. "You didn't have to help me. You didn't have to save me." Zara's lips twitched, a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Perhaps. But you are not like others, human." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that Jake couldn't quite place. She didn't elaborate, but he knew what she meant. In this universe, where species were often divided by war, culture, and biology, he was something different to her. And she was something different to him. As the last of the flames flickered out, the silence that followed felt almost deafening. The world around them was still, broken, but still alive. They had made it out, together. And somehow, Jake knew this was just the beginning of something far larger. "We need to keep moving," Zara said, her voice pulling him back from his thoughts. "The smoke will attract more attention. And we've already lost too much time." Jake nodded, knowing she was right. They couldn't stay here forever. With a final glance at the wreckage, they began to walk, Zara leading the way through the ruins, her pace steady and determined, while Jake followed closely behind, his mind racing with the realization that he had just formed a bond with someone far beyond what he could have imagined. In that moment, as they made their way toward an uncertain future, Jake knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun had barely begun to set as Jake and Zara made their way through the charred remains of the dome. The air was still heavy with smoke, the sky streaked with orange and red from the fire. They moved cautiously, every step deliberate, as the world around them seemed to tremble under the weight of their recent escape. Jake's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He had barely known Zara, but already, he felt a connection to her, something deeper than just survival. She had saved his life, pushed her own limits to ensure his escape. And yet, there was so much more to her, something hidden beneath the surface that Jake couldn't fully understand. Zara, for her part, remained focused, her golden eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Her alien nature, a constant reminder of how different their worlds were, seemed to disappear in the face of the immediate threat. She was a protector, a warrior, and at that moment, her calm, calculated movements were the only thing keeping them grounded. "We need to find shelter," Zara said, her voice steady, but Jake could hear the faintest edge of exhaustion in it. She had been pushing herself too hard, far beyond what her body should have been capable of. "The smoke is going to make it difficult to breathe, and there are always those who seek out the weak after a disaster." Jake nodded, his throat dry from the smoke, his muscles aching from the sprint through the burning dome. "Right," he replied, his voice rasping. They moved forward, navigating through the jagged remnants of the collapsed structure. Jake stumbled a few times, his legs unsteady, but Zara was always there, her strong hands helping him steady himself. As they walked, Jake couldn't help but steal glances at Zara. There was a grace to her, a quiet strength that he found mesmerizing. Despite the chaos, she exuded an aura of calm, like she was in complete control of the situation, even when it was clear she was just as affected by the destruction as he was. After a few minutes of walking, they found a small alcove in what used to be the corner of the dome. It offered little protection from the elements, but it was enough to shield them from the worst of the smoke. Zara crouched down, her eyes scanning the surroundings once more before she spoke again. "We should rest here for a while. There's no point in pushing ourselves further until the air clears." Jake lowered himself to the ground beside her, grateful for the brief respite. As he sat there, leaning against the wall of the collapsed structure, he thought about everything that had happened. The fire. The escape. Zara. You didn't have to save me, he said quietly, breaking the silence. Zara looked at him, her golden eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing his words. I did what was necessary, she replied, her voice soft but firm. Survival is not just about escaping danger, human. It is about protecting those who are worth saving. Jake stared at her, feeling the weight of her words. He had never thought of it that way. To him, survival had always been about just getting by, doing whatever it took to make it through. But Zara's words made him realize that there was more to it, something deeper. And what about you? He asked. What do you consider worth saving? Zara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat silently for a moment, her gaze distant, as if contemplating something far beyond their immediate surroundings. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. I protect those who cannot protect themselves. I fight for those who cannot fight back. Jake nodded slowly, understanding that her sense of duty ran deeper than anything he had ever known. She was not just a warrior, she was a protector, someone who had made it her life's purpose to safeguard others. As the minutes ticked by, the world around them seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. The fire had died down, the smoke beginning to clear as the winds picked up. Zara and Jake remained in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but united in the understanding that their fates were now intertwined. They had both survived the dome's collapse, but neither of them knew what would come next. The world outside had changed, and with it, the course of their lives. They would need each other to face what was to come. And for the first time, Jake felt a sense of hope, not just for his own survival, but for what lay ahead. Zara's presence beside him was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, there was strength to be found in unexpected places. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in deep shades of twilight. The air was cooler now, and the oppressive heat that had clung to them earlier had begun to ease. The smoke had almost cleared, but the faint smell of burning metal still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the chaos they had just escaped. Zara and Jake sat in the alcove they had found, taking in the fleeting moments of peace. Zara had been quiet for a while, her eyes scanning the landscape, ever watchful, even as her body showed signs of exhaustion. Jake, too, had been lost in thought, his mind still processing everything that had happened. The dome collapse. The fire. The escape. And most of all, Zara's sacrifice to save him. He couldn't shake the image of her pushing him out of the way, taking the brunt of the falling debris. You're still hurting, aren't you? Jake finally asked, his voice low, his concern evident. Zara turned her gaze to him, her golden eyes gleaming faintly in the fading light. I am fine, she replied simply, but there was a slight edge to her voice that Jake didn't miss. He knew she wasn't being entirely honest. The damage to the dome had been catastrophic, and Zara had been in the thick of it, not just fighting to survive, but fighting for both of them. He could see the strain in the way she moved, the way her breath came a little quicker than usual. Jake hesitated for a moment, then stood and walked over to her. You don't have to hide it, he said, crouching beside her. You saved me. The least I can do is help you now. Zara looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a small sigh, she relented. The fall was harder than I thought, she admitted. But I will be fine. We cannot waste time on what happened. Jake shook his head, not accepting her words. We're not going anywhere until you're at least able to walk without a limp, he said firmly. Zara raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You are persistent, human. I'm a good listener. Jake replied with a grin. And I'm not going anywhere without you. There was a brief silence before Zara spoke again, her voice softer than before. You don't know what you're offering. Jake was taken aback by the weight in her words. I don't, he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Zara met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I was raised to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I have spent years training for this. I have fought wars, saved entire civilizations. But I have never been cared for. Jake's heart tightened at her words. There was a vulnerability in Zara now that he hadn't seen before. I'm not like you, he said quietly. I'm not a soldier. But I care about you, Zara. And I'm not going to let you down. Zara seemed to consider his words carefully. For the first time since they had met, she seemed to soften. Her gaze held his for a long moment, the silent understanding between them deepening. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Jake, she said at last. But I think I could use someone like you. The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Jake didn't know what would come next, or where their journey would lead, but in that moment, he knew one thing for certain, they were in this together. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Zara and Jake stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. The world had changed, but their bond had only just begun to grow. They didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them spoke volumes. They had survived the worst together, and now, they would move forward, together. The night had grown colder, the stars now a distant backdrop to the quiet of the landscape. The fire from the collapsed dome was nothing but a memory, the smoke now cleared by the cool night winds. Jake and Zara had moved on, finding a place where they could rest, at least for a few hours. Their journey had taken them further from the destruction, but the weight of it still lingered in their minds. Zara sat against the remnants of a fallen structure, her eyes scanning the horizon, ever vigilant. Her body, though strong, had clearly taken a toll from the strain of the past day. Jake, sitting nearby, watched her, his thoughts a jumble of gratitude, awe, and something deeper he couldn't quite place. How long do you think we'll be safe out here? Jake finally asked, breaking the silence. Zara's gaze shifted to him, her golden eyes studying him with a careful expression. Safety is relative, she said. Out here, we are safe from the immediate danger, but the world is always in motion. We must keep moving. Jake nodded, understanding the unspoken truth in her words. He had seen the fire, the chaos, the destruction. But now, as he sat beside her, he realized that this journey was just beginning, and their survival depended on their ability to stay ahead of whatever threats came next. You're a warrior, aren't you? He asked quietly, his voice almost in awe. Zara turned her head to meet his gaze. I have been many things, she replied, her voice calm and steady. But yes, I am a warrior. Jake didn't speak for a moment, taking in her words. He had seen her in action, pushing herself beyond what seemed possible to save him. There was no question in his mind now, Zara was more than just a protector. She was a force to be reckoned with, a being who had lived through things he couldn't even imagine. I don't know what I would have done without you, Jake said, his voice filled with sincerity. Zara's lips twitched slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming. You would have found a way, she said simply. You humans are resourceful. Jake couldn't help but smile in return. I don't know about that. I think I'm just lucky to have you around. Zara's smile faded, and her expression grew serious. Luck is something that runs out when you least expect it, she said. That is why we must prepare, always. The weight of her words settled over him, and Jake understood. Survival wasn't about luck, it was about preparation, resilience, and, most of all, adaptability. He had learned that lesson the hard way, but now he was learning from someone who had mastered it. The night wore on, and the stars above them twinkled like silent witnesses to the events unfolding on the ground below. Zara leaned back slightly, her eyes still scanning the night, her body relaxed but alert. Jake lay back on the ground, staring up at the sky, the quiet hum of the world around them lulling him into a sense of calm. For the first time since the disaster, he felt a sense of peace. There was danger ahead, but for now, they had each other, and that gave him more confidence than he had ever known. As sleep began to pull at him, Jake heard Zara's voice again, soft and steady. Rest, Jake. Tomorrow we move again. He didn't reply, but he nodded slightly, his eyes closing as the weight of the day finally caught up with him. he trusted Zara more than he had trusted anyone in a long time. And that trust gave him the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would survive. The thought was simple, but for the first time, it felt like the truth. The morning sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the landscape. The world, though scarred from the night's chaos, was waking up once again. Jake stretched, feeling the soreness in his muscles from the previous day's ordeal. His body was tired, but there was a sense of quiet resolve within him now. As he looked over at Zara, he saw that she, too, had already risen, her posture tall and strong, though the slight limp in her step revealed the toll the escape had taken on her. She had been pushing herself hard, but Jake knew she wasn't one to show weakness. "Are we ready to move?" he asked, rising to his feet. Zara turned her head to look at him, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the area. "We leave soon," she said, her voice calm but decisive. "But first, we need to assess our supplies. We can't afford to be careless." Jake nodded, understanding. They had escaped the dome, but they were far from safe. The landscape around them was desolate, and they needed to stay sharp. As they gathered their things, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had never imagined his life would come to this. A few days ago, he had been living a quiet, mundane existence, working as an engineer in the city. Now, he was in a foreign land, with an alien warrior by his side, trying to survive in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Zara's voice broke through his thoughts. "We have enough supplies for another day, but we'll need more." "Water soon," she said. "The nearest settlement is a few miles to the north. It would be better if we head there before nightfall." Jake took a deep breath and nodded. "Lead the way." The two of them set off, walking through the barren landscape. The terrain was harsh, the ground cracked and dry from the heat of the fire. There were no signs of life, no plants or animals to speak of. It was as if the world had been scorched, left to recover in silence. As they walked, Jake found himself glancing at Zara. She was strong, no doubt about that. But there was a weariness in her eyes now, a vulnerability that he hadn't seen before. She was no longer the unshakable warrior he had first met, she was someone who had been through far more than anyone should have to endure. "You don't have to keep going," Jake said, his voice soft. "We can rest if you need to." Zara stopped in her tracks and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then she spoke. "I cannot rest." "Not yet." Her voice was quiet but firm. "We must keep moving. I have seen too much in my life to stop now." Jake didn't push her further. He understood what she meant. She wasn't just fighting for her survival, she was fighting for something greater. He knew that, deep down, she would keep going no matter how much it cost her. The walk to the settlement was long, the silence between them stretching on. But even in the quiet, Jake felt a growing sense of connection to Zara. They were from different worlds, yet here they were, walking side by side, surviving together. When they finally reached the settlement, it was nothing like Jake had expected. It was a small, run-down place, the buildings barely standing, with no signs of life except for the faint flicker of lights in the distance. Zara led the way to one of the buildings, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Jake followed closely, his senses alert. They had made it this far, but they knew the real challenge was just beginning. "Stay close," Zara said as she opened the door to the building. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of a generator was the only sound. There were a few crates and barrels scattered around, some of them half empty. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jake exhaled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. They had found shelter, for now. But as Zara began to inspect the supplies, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from safe. There were too many unknowns ahead, and the world they were in was far more dangerous than he had ever realized. But for now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. The settlement was eerily quiet as the two of them entered. Zara led the way, her eyes sharp and calculating, always alert for any signs of danger. Jake followed closely, the weight of the journey settling on his shoulders. The shelter they had found was a small, dilapidated structure, its walls cracked and its windows dusty. The interior was dimly lit by a flickering light overhead, casting long shadows across the room. Despite the worn appearance, it felt like a temporary safe haven, a place to catch their breath, even if just for a moment. As Zara moved to inspect the supplies, Jake took a seat on one of the old crates, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. They had come a long way from the dome, but the road ahead was uncertain. He could still feel the adrenaline from their escape coursing through him, but it was starting to wear off, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. The fire, the collapse, and everything that followed, it was all just the beginning. Zara's voice broke through his thoughts. "We have enough food for another 2 days," she said, her tone steady. "But the water supply is running low. We'll need to find more soon." Jake nodded. Water was their most immediate concern. They could go without food for a while, but dehydration was a different matter. He glanced over at her, his mind still trying to catch up with everything. "We'll find more," he said, trying to sound confident. Zara didn't look up, her focus still on the supplies. "We don't have the luxury of time," she replied, her voice quieter now. "We must keep moving." Jake felt the weight of her words. She was right, of course. They couldn't stay here forever. The world outside was unpredictable, dangerous, and they had no way of knowing when the next threat would come. It could be days, weeks, or even hours before they were forced to flee again. But for now, this place, broken and deserted as it was, offered them a small moment of respite. The silence between them grew, neither of them willing to break it. Jake felt the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that, though they were in this together, there were still vast differences between them. He was human, a man struggling to find his place in this alien world. She was Zara Lyrex, an alien warrior with a past and purpose far beyond anything he could understand. And yet, here they were, bound by their shared survival. Finally, Zara stood up, her sharp eyes scanning the room one last time before she spoke again. "I'll go check the perimeter," she said. "Stay here. Keep watch." Jake didn't argue. He knew better than to question her judgment. Zara was always the one who took charge, the one who made decisions. He was still trying to find his footing, still trying to figure out what his role was in all of this. As she moved toward the door, her movement swift and precise, Jake watched her go. There was something undeniably strong about her, something that made him feel safe in a world that was anything but. But even as she left the room, Jake couldn't help but feel a twinge of uncertainty. The world they were in was unpredictable, and Zara, despite her strength, was not invincible. The weight of their situation settled heavily on his shoulders. As the minutes passed, Jake remained alert, his eyes constantly scanning the room for any movement, any sign of danger. He had never been in a situation like this before, forced to rely on someone else for survival, a stranger from another world. But as the hours dragged on, something in him began to change. He wasn't just following Zara anymore. He was learning. Learning how to survive, how to adapt, how to fight. They were both still alive, and that was all that mattered for now. The sound of Zara's footsteps echoed in the distance, her silhouette barely visible against the dim light outside. Jake took a deep breath and stood up, ready for whatever came next. Together, they would face whatever the world threw at them. And no matter what happened, he knew they would survive. Because they had each other. The hours seemed to stretch on as Jake sat in the quiet of the shelter, his thoughts racing. The reality of their situation was starting to settle in. Zara had gone out to scout the perimeter, and although she had been gone for a while, Jake didn't question her decision. She was always so confident, so capable, while he was just a man who had been thrown into a world he didn't understand, trying to survive alongside an alien warrior. The weight of it all was beginning to wear on him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending to be strong. But as he sat there, trying to steady his nerves, a soft sound reached his ears, footsteps. Zara had returned. He stood up quickly, instinctively reaching for the weapon he'd been given. It was still foreign to him, but the need for self-defense had become apparent in this new world. The door creaked open, and Zara stepped in, her eye scanning the room for any signs of trouble. She was still moving with purpose, her body language calm, but Jake could see the slight tension in her posture. Something had happened out there. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Zara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We need to move," she said simply, her voice steady. "There are others in the area. I've been tracking them for the last hour." Jake felt his pulse quicken at the mention of others. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "Are they dangerous?" he asked, his grip tightening on the weapon. Zara didn't answer immediately. She walked over to a small table and began packing a few supplies into a bag. "Possibly," she said, her voice cool. "But they're not our priority right now. We need to leave before they find us." Jake nodded, grabbing his own things. The reality of their situation had just gotten more complicated. They were no longer just fighting to survive against the elements and the wreckage of the dome, now they had to deal with other survivors, or worse, hostile forces. As he finished packing, he glanced at Zara. She was already moving toward the door, her face set in a determined expression. "Let's go," she said, her voice final. Without hesitation, Jake followed her. As they stepped outside, the cold night air hit him immediately, but it wasn't the cold that made him uneasy. It was the silence. The world around them was still, but Jake knew that silence could mean danger. They moved quickly, staying close to the shadows as they navigated through the remains of the settlement. Zara led the way, her senses sharper than his, always alert to any sound, any movement. Jake kept his eyes peeled, his nerves on edge as they crossed the open space. Every crunch of gravel underfoot seemed too loud in the stillness of the night. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the settlement. Zara stopped, holding up a hand, signaling for Jake to be quiet. She crouched down, peering over a small hill. Jake followed her lead, his heart pounding as he tried to stay as still as possible. What they saw made his stomach drop. In the distance, a group of figures moved through the wreckage of a nearby building. They were clearly human, but there was something off about them. They moved in a way that suggested they were armed, and their body language was aggressive, scanning the area for something or someone. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They had been spotted. Zara's hand shot out, grabbing his arm and pulling him back into the shadows. "We need to keep moving," she whispered urgently. "They'll see us if we stay here." Jake's mind raced as he nodded, following Zara's lead as they moved quickly, carefully avoiding detection. As they continued their escape, Jake's thoughts turned to the future. There was no guarantee of safety anymore. They couldn't outrun their problems forever. But as long as they were together, there was hope. And hope, Jake realized, was something worth fighting for. The night was colder now, the wind picking up as it swept through the barren landscape. Zara and Jake moved quietly, staying close to the crumbled remains of buildings, their footsteps soft against the gravel. Every now and then, Zara would pause, her keen senses on high alert, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Jake followed her lead, doing his best to stay low and avoid making noise. They had managed to stay out of sight so far, but Jake knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Eventually, they would have to confront whatever dangers lay ahead. "How far are we from the next settlement?" Jake whispered, keeping his voice as low as possible. Zara glanced back at him, her expression calm, but there was a glint of concern in her eyes. "About 5 miles, she replied, her voice steady. "But we won't be able to get there if we don't move quickly. We need to find shelter for the night." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the journey pressing down on him. 5 miles wasn't far, but in this world, with everything that had happened, it might as well have been 100. They kept moving, the night growing darker around them. The only sound was the wind, a constant companion as they walked through the deserted streets. Jake's mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. It felt like just yesterday he had been living a normal life, working in a quiet corner of the city. Now, he was on the run, trying to survive in a world that seemed completely foreign to him. And through it all, Zara was there, a constant presence beside him. She was stronger than he could ever hope to be, but there was something about her, something that made Jake feel like she wasn't just a warrior. She was someone who had lived through things he couldn't even imagine. "Do you ever get tired?" Jake asked, his voice softer now, as they walked side by side. Zara didn't respond immediately, but Jake could see the faintest shift in her posture. She was tired. He could tell. "I've been tired for a long time," she said, her voice low but not defeated. "But we don't have the luxury of resting. We fight because we must. We survive because we have no other choice." Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her. She had been fighting for so long, for so many, that it seemed like it was all she knew. He couldn't imagine living like that, never having the chance to stop and breathe, to just exist without the weight of responsibility pressing down on you. "I'm glad I'm not alone in this," Jake said quietly. Zara glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "You're not alone," she said, her voice reassuring. "But you have to be strong. Not just for yourself, but for the both of us." They walked in silence for a while longer, the miles stretching out before them. The shelter was still a few miles away, but Jake knew they had to keep going. They couldn't afford to stop now. Not when they were so close to safety. Eventually, they reached a small, abandoned building on the outskirts of a nearby town. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for the night. Zara took the lead again, entering the building first to make sure it was safe. Jake followed her inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air was stale, but it was better than being out in the open. "This will do for now," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She dropped her bag onto the floor and began to check the area for any supplies. Jake set his own bag down and looked around. The place was empty, but at least it was quiet. They could rest here for the night. Zara moved to the corner of the room, sitting down with her back against the wall. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing steady, though Jake could see the exhaustion in her features. She had been through so much. "We'll rest here," she said after a long pause. "But we leave at first light. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long." Jake nodded, understanding. He didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary, but for tonight, it was the safest option. As he sat down across from Zara, he realized how much they had been through together. They had survived the collapse of the dome, fought off the dangers of the world outside, and now they were here, resting in a place that felt like a temporary reprieve. But they both knew that this was just another step in their journey. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that thought, somehow, gave Jake a sense of peace. He wasn't alone in this fight. Zara was there. And that was all that mattered.